Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Wisdom Dharma Chat. And thank you. We're so sorry that we're a little bit late. Jay was rushing over from a late train, and it's well worth the wait. We have the famous Buddhist philosopher, the professor, the great translator. So, Jay, thank you for making the time and joining us on Wisdom Dharma Chats tonight.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a total pleasure being here, even if it was a crazy dash.
So we're all ready to go. We're going to jump straight into it. So the format is Jay and I will have a conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and you, the audience, get to ask your questions to Jay. So you can start actually collecting those questions as we speak, and you can just put them in the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. We'll collect them, and then I'll have them when I come back after the break. So now we'll get into the conversation. And so Jay and I were just quickly thinking what we're going to talk about tonight. And I thought maybe something about selflessness and why we should be good. Maybe we start there.
Those are good questions. Those are good questions. Yeah. Where do you want to start, Dan?
Well, I thought one of your most recent books was Losing Yourself. Is that?
Losing Ourselves.
Losing Ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought we'd start there because that's a more general book on selflessness that actually gets into ethics as well. It
does, because I think that the real point of realizing selflessness, the real point of thinking about selflessness is ethical. In fact, I would say, now I get to just quote my teacher, Geshe Yeshitapka, who once famously said, "Every syllable of Buddha Dharma is about ethics."
Wow.
And I kind of believe that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that book is more a popular audience book. So it's a book that is more accessible to a lot of people. It's not fussy and philological, and it's not technical. And what I'm exploring there is just the distinction between being a self and being a person, and why we're not selves and don't have selves, and why selves don't make any sense, but why that doesn't mean that we're non-existent. We exist as persons, and that means we exist as interdependent entities embedded in the world, rather than selves who act on the world and experience the world. I think that's a good way to think.
So this is actually how the book starts, with you making the case that we should separate this idea of self and this idea of person.
That's right. That's right.
And then you try and convince us that we actually do have this idea of self
innately.
And I thought it was very clever the way you do that. And you do that like a great philosopher, do that with a thought experiment.
Thought experiments are fun. Yeah, so here's the deal. I think that it's absolutely correct that even though it makes no sense to conceive of our mode of existence as that of selves, we have a very powerful innate tendency to understand ourselves that way. And I think we're kind of wired for that. And I think it's one of those fundamental illusions that evolution has left us with. People are always familiar with optical illusions, like the Mueller-Lyer illusion. People are familiar maybe with auditory illusions that we can generate. But there are also cognitive illusions, illusions for which we're wired, that allow us to think in ways that distort our mode of existence or the mode of existence of things around us. Some of those cognitive illusions are on the object side. That is, we experience the world and we take things to exist in a way that they don't exist. We can talk about that if you want. But some of the illusions that I'm concerned with in that book are on the subject side, that we understand ourselves in ways that don't match our mode of existence. When you think about illusion in the context of Indian philosophy, and Buddhism is an Indian philosophical system, an illusion is always defined as a distinction between the mode of existence of a thing and its mode of appearance. So when we say that something's illusory, we're not saying that it doesn't exist. We're saying that it exists in one way and appears in another. We do exist as persons, but we appear to exist to ourselves and to others as selves. So we can understand that that's so using the crazy thought experiments with which I opened the book. And not everybody's convinced by these thought experiments, but they should be.
Okay.
And the thing about thought experiments, because I'm going to be talking about imagination, and the wonderful thing about imagination is that we can imagine things that are impossible. And that's important because sometimes we develop philosophical conceptions that actually don't make any sense. So I don't want to argue, and I never would argue, that imaginability tracks possibility. What it tracks is our ability to think in certain ways. So here's how it goes.
We can imagine things that are not possible.
We can. So for instance, to take boring examples, I mean, I can imagine somebody proving that arithmetic is complete and consistent, even though I know that it's not possible. But, excuse me, what I'd like us to imagine are things that often play roles in philosophical thought experiments, even though I think they're incoherent. One is to imagine the possibility of a body transplant. And what I mean is that I could inhabit somebody else's body. And I think here's the way that you can really get yourself into this. I want you to think of somebody whose body you would like to inhabit. Maybe just for a few minutes, maybe permanently, I don't care. And I'm not going to ask you who it is because that gets deep and personal and sometimes embarrassing. But just imagine somebody whose body you'd like. I will tell you mine, okay? And I come clean about this in the book, and so I'm beyond embarrassment. I would like Usain Bolt's body for about 9.4 seconds when he was in his prime, because I would love to feel what it's like to run that fast. Now, notice that when I say that, I'm not saying that I want to be Usain Bolt, because that does me absolutely no good at all. Usain Bolt is already Usain Bolt. That works just fine. And I also don't want to just have Usain Bolt tell me what it feels like to run really fast. I've heard him talk on the television. I don't care. I want to know what it's like for me, Jay, to run that fast by being in Usain Bolt's body. Now, I'm not claiming that it makes any sense for me to have Usain Bolt's body, but I can form that desire, and I'll bet you can too. And if you can even form the desire, then you have told yourself that you do not take yourself to be identical to your body. You take yourself to be somebody who has a body, but could have a different body. And the moment you do that, you say, okay, whatever I take myself to be, it's distinct from my body. That doesn't mean you are distinct from it. It means you take yourself to be distinct from it. Now, a slightly harder one. I want you to imagine somebody whose mind you'd like to have. Maybe if only for a few minutes, maybe for a while. Again, I'll come clean. These days, I want Carlo Rovelli's mind, because I really want to understand quantum gravity. And I really want to understand the general theory of relativity and to see the world the way Carlo does. Now, I don't want to be Carlo. Carlo is already Carlo, and it doesn't do me a bit of good. And I don't want him to tell me what it's like to be as great a physicist as he is. He's already told me that, and it doesn't help me at all. I want to be me, Jay, with Carlo Rovelli's mind, just for a little while, so I can understand that stuff. Now, if you can frame a desire like that, whether or not it makes any sense, then you've also told yourself that you don't take yourself to be identical to your mind. You take yourself to be somebody who has a mind and has a body and might have had a different mind or a different body. That first thing you take yourself to be, something standing behind as the possessor of your body, as the subject and the agent who uses your body and mind as instruments to interact with the world. That thing you take yourself to be, that's the self. That's the Atman, that's the soul, that's the Suke. And I think that what we see in the world's philosophical systems, whether they're the classical Greek systems, the Orthodox Indian systems, doesn't matter. What we see is people taking that intuition, that atavistic sense that we have, that we are something more than our psychophysical complex, and turn that into rarefied metaphysics. And that's where we get notions like souls and Atmans and Sukes and things like that. So what I try to do in the book, Daniel, is to convince people that that thing is an illusion, that we never were that what we are instead are ongoing, causally connected, conventionally imputed sets of psychophysical processes in open causal interaction with the world, embedded in a world that makes us who we are. And it makes a hell of a lot more sense, because when you start pushing the self model really hard, it starts sounding really stupid. For instance, let me just, for instance, the last few days I've been teaching Kant in my class on self and no self, and we've been teaching the transcendental deduction of the categories, where students learn that their being is outside of space and time. Now, if your metaphysics forces you to concede that you exist outside of space and time, something has gone seriously friggin' wrong, okay? That's what I want to say. And that's where all of this ends up going. When we read the metaphysics of Atman, it becomes this thing that is not in the world, but acts on the world, experiences the world. Do you really believe that you don't exist in the world? I don't think so. So the part of the task of a rational metaphysics, the kind of metaphysics I think that we find in the Madhyamaka tradition, the kind of metaphysics that we see in the Humean tradition, is to try to understand ourselves as persons, not as selves. And that's what I try to do in that book.
Brilliant, brilliant. I think we could talk about the thought experiment all night, but let's step through it a little bit more slowly, right? So you mentioned, so the body one, I'm
You get that one?
Yeah, totally get that. And then you said,
you don't want to tell me whose body it is, though, I'll bet.
What's that?
I'll bet you don't want to tell me whose body you want.
Well, I actually was thinking of a deity, since I could imagine it.
Oh, that would be cool.
What would it be like to be a deity? That was my...
Yeah, how many arms do you want?
Exactly, exactly. So I thought if I can imagine anything that's possible, why not try that?
Yeah.
That's what I was trying to do. But then you mentioned that, okay, we'll do the next one, which is a little bit more harder.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Why do you think the mind is a little bit more harder? And I found it is, right? And so if I was picking someone and, and then I don't want their whole mind. So I was starting to make making a negotiation with, well, how much of my mind do I really have to give away?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I think what I want you to, the desire that I want you to develop, and as I said, I want you to think of this as desire, because desire is really cool. We can desire almost anything. Yeah. Which is kind of scary. Yeah. What I want you to desire is to have your subjectivity, your awareness, but somebody else's cognitive faculties.
Yes.
To be that smart, that acute, maybe even that nice. Yeah. And to know what it's like to kind of see the world through that kind of mind.
That's sort of what I was doing.
Yeah.
And it feels like that if I keep this subjectivity,
yep,
I'm keeping a little bit. I'm almost found the me, right? Someone might say, okay, I'm not my intellect. I'm not my personality. I'm now what I realized through this thought experiment, that I'm subjectivity, for example.
Or that you take yourself to be that.
Or I take myself to be.
This thought experiment can't tell you anything about what you are.
Yes.
Thought experiments can't do that.
No.
Right. I mean, I think philosophy has just gone off the rails when it uses thought experiments.
It's telling me what I believe.
Right.
Yeah.
It tells you what you believe.
Yeah.
It's telling you something about your phenomenology.
Yeah.
It's telling you that deep down, when you say I, you think you're referring to a self, and you're not.
Okay, that seemed to jump, right? Because we're talking about subjectivity.
Yeah.
So we got down to, I think that
something distinct from your psychophysical complex that could stand behind another one.
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
Why is this showing me the self rather than the person, this thought? Why is this showing, let me be careful. Why is this showing me what I believe to be the self rather than what I believe to be the person?
Because, so let's talk about the difference between a person and the self, because we haven't introduced that yet. Yeah. And that's important. And it's complicated to even say this, because often people use those terms interchangeably. And even people who distinguish them in different ways. So you kind of got to ask, what do you mean by self? What do you mean by person? And I want you to point at me and say, so Jay, what do you mean by self and person? And I'll tell you.
Thank you.
I'm happy to do that. So I've indicated what I mean by self. And I think it's really important to get a fix on that, because I do think that right at the root of most of our fundamental misconceptions about who we are, our own self-alienation, and I think at the beginning of a lot of really, how to put it, pathological sorts of moral interaction with the world, lies that illusion of self. So we've talked about that, but let's talk about person for a moment. The English word person, as probably most of the folks in the audience know, derives from the Latin word persona. But what people don't often remember about persona is that it has a root meaning too. And what it means is a mask. And in particular, the kind of mask that was worn in the theater. So what it really means is a role. And we still encounter it in that locution when we open up a play and it says dramatis personae, who are the characters or the roles in the play. So if we were looking at Hamlet and Ophelia and Claudius are persons, personae in that play, dramatis personae. They're not actors, right? If Benedict Cumberbatch is playing Hamlet, he doesn't get entered in the dramatis personae, he gets entered in the cast.
Yeah.
So when we think about a person, we're really thinking about a kind of role, a social role. And so when I use the word person to talk about us, what I'm talking about is who we are in our ordinary conventional lives. And persons extend over time, but they constantly change. They're in interaction. They supervene on psychophysical processes, as well as on conventions for identification, ways of talking, ways of behaving, and so forth. Persons have sloppy boundaries. That's what we are. So when we say that we want to expunge the illusion of the self, what we want to do is to argue that we exist in one way as persons, but appear to ourselves and others in another way, that is, as selves. So we pull out the substantiality, we pull out the unchangingness, we pull out the standing behind and being distinct from our psychophysical aggregates. We also pull out the identity. As I said, we supervene on these, but also on more than that. And so I think of us as kind of fuzzy boundary, constantly changing, collectively constituted roles. When I say that these are roles in a kind of drama, the human drama, I kind of mean that pretty literally. Not a role in a play that any one person wrote. I didn't write that play. You didn't write that play. But it's more as though we have roles in a fabulous collective improv that we're constantly doing and creating, transforming, and recreating the persons we are all the time. That allows us to let go of a sense of permanence. It allows us to let go of a sense of ego. It allows us to let go of a sense of independence. And most important, it allows us to let go of a very primal kind of subject-object duality that takes us to be subjects and everybody else in the world to be our objects. That's where the ethical stuff happens.
Okay.
Because the moment you do that, the moment I do that, then everybody else is fundamentally different from me. Because I'm the transcendental guy who makes the world, and everybody else is just, the stuff that's in the world.
Yeah.
The moment you do that, genuine ethical interaction, genuine care, genuine rejoicing in others' happiness, genuine friendliness, it becomes impossible. Genuine impartiality becomes impossible. Yeah. So if we want to make possible a real ethical comportment, we want to see who we are as akin to who everybody else is. And that means dropping that kind of illusion of subjectivity and transcendent agency.
So this idea that the self is an appearance of the person, right?
Yeah.
Which is the mode, which is like a dependent arising, right? It's very interesting because normally the way you describe like persona and this relationship to mask, because normally we think of masks as the thing that we, that we're playing, the role we're playing is not us. And actually there's something real playing the role. And this flips that on the head.
Flips it completely.
Yeah.
I like that flip.
Yeah.
I really like the idea when people say, okay, well, you're a role, but who's the actor playing you? I want to say nobody. We're kind of self-playing roles.
Yeah. And it's like that there is only the role, but suddenly the role starts to think that there's someone playing it.
Exactly.
Or really has the appearance that someone is playing this role.
That's right. That's right. And we start taking each other a little bit too seriously.
Yeah. And that you're describing is a cognitive illusion.
That's a cognitive illusion.
And it's also a subjective illusion rather than an objective illusion.
Exactly. It's an illusion on the subject side.
Yeah.
And I think that's really kind of cool. Yeah. And I actually think it's really important to diagnose it. Because one of the things that I find especially profound about Buddhist philosophy in particular. So in general, I don't want to say, oh, gee, Buddhist philosophy is so much better than Western philosophy or anything. I hate that stuff. But here's an intuition that really developed especially in the Yogacara tradition of Buddhist philosophy, that really doesn't have a clear parallel of nearly this kind of precision in the Western tradition. It does have a neat parallel, I think, in the classical Chinese tradition, but not in the Western tradition. And that is the fact that the illusions from which we suffer aren't just illusions about the natures of the objects of our knowledge. Everybody agrees with that. I mean, everybody knows, gee, we might be wrong about the length of the Mueller-Lyer lines. Everybody knows that we have, color illusions, auditory illusions. We're familiar with those.
Yeah.
But the subjective illusions are not as familiar, because we often think that even if we could be radically mistaken about the objects in the external world, we think we can't possibly be mistaken about what's going on in our inner world, about who we are. That's an intuition we see, really elevated in Augustine, elevated in Descartes, elevated in Berkeley, and all over the place, right? And it's there in the 20th century in logical positivism and sense datum theory. It's there right now in the consciousness industry in spades. And philosophy has made a lot out of that illusion. Instead of diagnosing it, it's run with it too far. But Yogacaran philosophers, when they've pointed out that our understanding of our own subjectivity is fundamentally erroneous, that we might experience our relationship to the world as one of subject-object duality, that we might experience the world as existing just as it appears to us, and our senses as just delivering a world to us instead of helping us construct one, and that's wrong, I find extremely profound. So once you take seriously the idea that our knowledge of our own inner being is only achieved through introspection, and that introspection is a cognitive, maybe sensory activity that is just as fallible, just as prone to illusion as all of our external senses, then you realize that we only know ourselves as we appear to ourselves, not as we are. And the deep abyss that opens up there is that you then think, oh my God, is there a way that I am?
Yeah.
And then we return to that beautiful line in the Lankavatara Sutra. This triple world is not as it appears, nor is it otherwise. There is no way that things are. And I think that's a very, very profound insight. As I said, it's really made poignant in the Yogacara tradition. It's been there in Buddhism from the very beginning. And it's been there in Buddhism from the very beginning through the recognition that even the internal sense faculty, the mental sense faculty, is a sense faculty and subject to delusion. But once we really explore how profound that delusion can be and understand that we really are always strangers to ourselves, it's really quite a powerful realization. So I think that the self-illusion is part of that complex.
Wow.
Stop.
So you've taken, so I was expecting you to take the authority of our senses away in some way, that things, the way they're given to us are maybe
it's worse
problematic.
Than that.
But then now you're taking introspection away from us as well.
I'm taking it all away.
So
and I think it's important to do that.
Yeah.
So, all right, I'm going to jump traditions for a moment.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about one of my favorite Dogen fascicles for a minute. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Can you do some Dogen?
Let's do Dogen.
And it's Gabyo. Painted rice cakes. Dogen begins with this wonderful exploration of a very familiar Chan saying, painted rice cakes can't satisfy hunger. And of course, it's usually understood, as he points out, in a very pedestrian way, to mean that, texts and words can't really give you reality. They're just painted rice cakes, and we do all of that. And he says, if you understand it that way, he compares that to the ravings of boring old skin bags, right? He said, that's just a totally boring way to see this. Because makes the following wonderful point. He says, the paint that we use for painting rice cakes is the same paint we use for painting mountains and waters. The same paint we use for painting the sky. The same paint we use for painting bamboo. The same paint we use for painting hunger. And painted rice cakes can satisfy painted hunger just fine. And his point, it's very, very, very profound, that the boring reading of painted rice cakes suggests a duality between appearance and reality, and that we're just stuck with appearance and have to somehow get to reality. And Dogen's point is that all we ever have is the way the world appears to us. That's it. That you don't get behind the painted rice cakes and find real ones. It's paint all the way down. And what he's talking about is cognitive construction. So something I always ask my students to reflect on when we start talking about this stuff is this. I said, if we just look around the world. So I'm looking at all of these books. I'm looking at this beautiful Tangyur and Kangyur here. I'm looking at you. And if I were to just ask myself naively, in what Husserl beautifully calls the natural attitude, how does the world look? I'd say, well, here's how it looks. Let me describe the books. Let me describe the colors here. Let me describe Daniel. And then it's worth asking ourselves a really deep question. And it's a question that Buddhist philosophers ask in terms of the 6 realms within the wheel of cyclic existence. Imagine a bee flying through here. Bees have these amazing compound eyes with a toroidal space, and they can see in the infrared and the ultraviolet. And so when they look at this room, things are shaped differently, things are colored differently, everything is different from the way we see it. And then imagine a dog coming in. Dogs have fairly impoverished visual systems, but these giant olfactory bulbs. And so they experience the world as volumes of smell that might have visual stuff attached to them and so forth. And so the dog is going to experience this world completely differently. And now ask yourself the stupidest question you could possibly ask. Who's right? Does the world really look the way the bee sees it? Or does it really look the way I see it? Or does it really look the way the dog sees it? And the moment you ask yourself that question, you realize there is no way the world looks. There's just a way it shows up for me, shows up for a dog, shows up for a bee. And once you realize that, then you realize the depth of objective illusion. It's not just that I might see something wrong. It's that everything I see is wrong. Wrong not because it's not the way it shows up for me, but because my naive, immediate way of accepting my experience is to think that my senses and my mind are just handing the world to me as it is. And then I'm confusing something that I've created with something that pre-exists. And that's what Dogen means by paint. I'm painting the world constantly. And it's only by painting it that I can experience it. If you say, no, I want to get beyond that. I want to see the world directly. That means seeing the world without experiencing it. And you can't do that.
This makes a lot of sense, right? And it seems, so I've got 1,000 questions. Maybe I'll just throw a few at you and you can choose. So one of the questions is, okay, that makes total sense. And you've got the bee coming through and you're saying, and as soon as you ask, well, who's right? You've made a mistake, right? Because you're assuming that the world is some way.
And when you see that mistake, everything falls.
Everything collapses. Now, but I want to talk about subjectivity and how subjectivity has the same mistake. Because subjectivity seems to operate in the same way as it thinks that I am a certain way, if we're going to take self.
Exactly.
Right? But there's no other bee buzzing around to invalidate that. So why is there the similar mistake? What would
that's a good question. Let's start right there. So one of the reasons that I was talking about this depth of objective illusion is because the deep objective illusion, the illusion of immediacy of perception, is deeply tied to the illusion of subjectivity. Because once we see what that illusion is about, we see that it's not just an illusion of objectivity. It's an illusion that somehow I, as subject, I'm just sitting here receiving the information from the world. And that is the illusion of subject-object duality. When Yogacaran philosophers tell us that the fundamental illusion is subject-object duality, and that emptiness is emptiness of that subject-object duality, they are telling us what Dogen's telling us. The only way of understanding the world is to understand it as something that we are constituting and painting.
Yeah.
And so that's what connects to it. You
Got it.
right?
Yeah.
So
as soon as you accept that there's not a way the world is, you have to accept that there's not a way that you are.
exactly.
And therefore subjectivity has to be incorrect.
Exactly. So when we get to the end of a beautiful text like Trisvabhavanirdesha,
Yeah.
the treatise on the three natures, and Vasubandhu says, when we stop seeing the external world, we also stop seeing the mind.
Yeah.
It's not as though there's nothing there, but what we've stopped doing is saying, oh, there's two poles in our experience, the subjective pole and the objective pole.
Yeah.
That's the illusion. And that's as profound a cognitive illusion as there could possibly be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's a dependent origination thing, not just a Yogacaran
Exactly.
thing, it seems.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's just thematized so beautifully in the Yogacara discussions of subject-object duality and the three natures and three emptinesses.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So then another question I had, this is a fun question.
Hmm.
So you mentioned Dogen and that it's paint all the way down, right?
Yeah.
Let's introduce Chandrakirti to the conversation.
It's always good to introduce Chandrakirti.
How does Chandrakirti respond? Because he's also talks about like painting, milking a cow on the wall and all this sort
Yeah,
of stuff.
it's fun that metaphor keeps
Yeah.
coming up, isn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah. So actually, all of my reflection on person and self comes straight out of Chandrakirti.
Mhm.
As you probably know, as you do know, a lot of my life has orbited around Chandrakirti.
Yeah.
Like Chandrakirti and Hume are the two
Yeah.
suns around which I kind of orbit. And the distinction between the self and the person is one that Chandrakirti draws very explicitly in Madhyamaka Avatar, Introduction to the Middle Way.
Yeah.
And so what makes that discussion in the 6th chapter of the nature of selflessness so profound is that Chandrakirti emphasizes that while he's offering a complete reductio on the idea that we're selves, the conclusion of that argument is not that we don't exist, any more than the analysis of the chariot that he borrows from the Milinda Panya is supposed to show that the chariot doesn't exist.
Mm.
It shows that our mode of existence is different from what you thought.
Yeah.
And it's really important that Chandrakirti makes the point, and he's so subtle about this, that the person is not identical to the psychophysical clusters. It's not different from the psychophysical clusters. It doesn't just supervene on those clusters. It's actually a dependent designation based on them.
Mm-hmm.
So he puts the ontological level, the level of being of the person at a different plane. And it's not a mystical plane. It's a purely conventional plane. And it's not weird. And I really want to emphasize that. We are familiar with stuff that exists on that plane all the time. And the best example, one that I use ad nauseum, my students are tired of it, is money.
Yeah.
If, for instance, I say, hey, Daniel, I need to borrow $5 to get a cappuccino, and you hand me a $5 note, you've handed me $5.
Yeah.
And tomorrow, if I pay you back by, say, Venmo, I've paid you back the $5 you lent me.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't given you the $5 note that you gave me back. It's the same $5. The $5 supervened on that $5 note when you handed it to me, but not just on that $5 note, on the US Treasury system, on the Federal Reserve, on the fact that we're still willing to accept US currency, on a whole bunch of practices like that. When I Venmo'd, it supervened on an electronic payment system, on my mobile phone, on your mobile phone, on both of our banks and stuff like that. But that was that same $5. So we're used to the idea that things can exist on one plane and be related to the physical world in a particular way, but not be identical to it nor different from it. Yeah. So when you handed me the $5, you didn't hand me two things, a $5 note and $5.
Yeah.
But you didn't hand me $5 that were identical to that $5 note either. Similarly, persons aren't identical to our psychophysical clusters, but they're also not different from them. They supervene on them and much more, just as dollars supervene on pieces of paper or stacks of metal or bits in a computer and much more.
What is this level of reality you're talking about? We hear these
Conventional.
Conventional, but we hear these, let's describe more. We hear this like nearly led by mind and all this sort of stuff, right? Is that what you're talking about? And then if it seems as though, okay, if we're going to describe this level of relationship in some way, that let's call it merely led by mind, that's necessary but not sufficient, because I could write $5 on this piece of paper and give it to you, right?
And that wouldn't work.
And that wouldn't work. So what is,
But you
what
might
makes
write,
it
I owe you $5 and sign it.
Yeah, and
And maybe if you put it on a check form, then it would work, right?
Yeah.
So it just depends on how we're operating, right?
So what's the extra condition here that makes these two things different?
The extra condition is the conventions that we have and our participation in those conventions.
Yeah.
And when Chandrakirti calls this samvarti satya, when he calls it conventional truth, that's what he means.
Yeah.
Conventions constitute truth. And it's really important to see that. They're not what you have instead of truth. They constitute truth. Just because the reality of US currency is established only by conventions, it doesn't mean that it's not true that that $5 note is worth 5 times as much as a $1 note.
What's the difference between a convention and a label?
Well, anybody can write a label, but only once that label becomes a kind of piece in a collective game and has rules of use attached to it, does it become a convention. Convention, coming together.
Exactly.
When we join together, we can constitute the normativity that's important in conventions. Convention and normativity, they go together like this. That's what Hume pointed out so beautifully.
And this is why persons are embedded in the world.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely.
Exactly.
And you honestly don't have to be doing this kind of philosophy to see that. You could just be doing really boring evolutionary anthropology and ask yourself, what is it that is distinctive about this particular species of great ape, Homo sapiens sapiens? Well, there's a lot of things that are distinctive about it, right? It's the one that gets to destroy the world and all kinds of things like that. But here's the main thing that's distinctive about it. It's the hypersocial great ape. It's the great ape whose very being, whose mode of existence only makes sense in the context of an extremely rich social milieu. And aside from that, it's just nothing. Who we are depends upon the social conventions in which we participate, full stop. And it's that deep penetration of convention into our lives through language, through ethics, through economics, through etiquette, through everything that we do that makes us who we are.
This point on language I want to come back to, but I just want to stick with the conversation with Dogen and Chandrakirti. So we put them in conversation, and Chandrakirti has a lot to say about conventions.
Absolutely.
Is that something more than Dogen had to say, or is Dogen right there with him?
Dogen doesn't thematize convention to the degree that Chandrakirti does. At least not in, I have to be careful about that because I have certainly not read everything of Dogen, and even most of what I've read I haven't understood.
That's Dogen, but
he's Dogen. But I don't read Dogen as thematizing convention per se, as much as Chandrakirti does. I see Dogen as thematizing the kind of structure of subjectivity and the relationship of our subjectivity to our ontology. Now, I think convention is lurking in there. So I think when Dogen is talking about the paints that allow us to paint mountains and waters, it's not just my own psychological paints, it's collective paint. But he doesn't thematize that the way Chandrakirti does. Chandrakirti is thematizing our collective nature in a way that's just absolutely staggering.
Brilliant. And so I wonder if Dogen can get us the same type of ethics, do you think?
That's a really interesting question. And I'm going to give you a powerful, I don't know. I personally, as I read the Chan and Zen tradition for ethical thought, don't find nearly as much as I find in the Indian Buddhist tradition. A lot of my friends who are sinologists tell me I'm just not reading carefully enough, and they may be right. But I don't see the kind of emphasis that we see say in Aryadeva, in Chandrakirti, and then of course in Shantideva or Buddhaghosa. I don't see that happening as much in the Chan tradition. On the other hand, I mean, we do have the great vows, right?
Yeah.
Which are deeply ethical vows, and we have the Bodhisattva vows in that tradition. It's just that what I don't see is the systematic treatises that are working out the content of ethics in the way that I see them in India.
You have a brilliant presentation of vows in your Buddhist ethics book, which I think is fantastic. Probably that'll take us in a different direction.
It can.
But I was thinking maybe something I always wanted to ask you over the years. Why is Chandrakirti your hero versus Tsongkhapa, right? It feels like, and the reason I asked that question, it feels like Tsongkhapa is stronger on the conventional, right?
Well, that by that question hangs a complicated hermeneutic debate, as you know.
Yeah.
I read Chandrakirti through Tsongkhapa shamelessly. And I think that Tsongkhapa gets Chandrakirti absolutely right. So I think that Umagompa Rabsel, the elimination of the intent, is one of the most staggering pieces of philosophical commentary ever composed, full stop. As you know, that is not a unanimous position.
Yes.
There are many important commentaries on Madhyamaka Avatara in Tibet, and many of them, most of them, disagree with Tsongkhapa's reading. And there's the fabulous Daktsang debate that the Yak herds explored in the last few years that really takes that debate very deep. So I don't want to say that it's perfectly obvious that it's correct to read Tsongkhapa through Chandrakirti, just that it's true. So when I say I orbit around Chandrakirti and you say, why not Tsongkhapa? I say, because Tsongkhapa is just getting Chandrakirti right. Okay. So I read him through Tsongkhapa constantly.
Yes.
But I think Tsongkhapa just has this brilliant insight into what Chandrakirti is doing.
Yes.
And when you look at the difference between the way Tsongkhapa reads Chandrakirti and the way that Gorampa reads Chandrakirti, the way that Rendauer reads Chandrakirti, the way that Mipam Rinpoche reads Chandrakirti, the way that Daktsang reads Chandrakirti, the way that Mikya Dorje and Wangchuk Dorje read Chandrakirti, then what you see is that Tsongkhapa takes that the importance of the truth in conventional truth really seriously, where they take the conventional in conventional truth more seriously and see conventional truth as what you do until ultimate truth comes along, where Tsongkhapa sees conventional truth as the truth. That's the painted rice cakes, right? And I think Tsongkhapa is dead right about that, because I think the only way that you make sense of the doctrine of the two truths is that beautiful, beautiful phrase: intentionally identical, extensionally identical, intentionally distinct.
Yes.
Moba Chikla Dukpatada.
Yeah.
And that is the way to make sense of the two truths. Tsongkhapa saw that, and he saw that through commenting on Chandrakirti, who saw it very, very clearly. That's how I see it.
What's your translation of that?
Extensionally identical, intentionally distinct.
Intentionally distinct.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that for us, that translation?
So when we talk about intentional versus extensional identity, let's just jump to 21st and 20th century Western thought, and let's go to Frege, right? So if we're talking about the morning star and the evening star, they're both Venus.
Yes.
They are extensionally identical. You cannot land on the morning star without landing on the meaning of the evening star.
Yeah.
But when we think about the evening star, we think about it in a different way from the morning star, and you could believe that they were different. So they're intentionally distinct.
Yes.
Two different modes of appearance of the same thing.
Yeah.
So another way to think about it, Joe Biden is both head of the Democratic Party and commander-in-chief of the Armed Forces of the United States.
Yeah.
So it's true that the commander-in-chief of the Armed Forces of the United States is the head of the Democratic Party, extensionally, but not intentionally.
Yeah.
You don't get to be commander-in-chief just by running the Democratic Party, and you don't get to run the Democratic Party by being commander-in-chief, right? Those intentions can coincide sometimes extensionally and not otherwise. So when Tsongkhapa is saying Ngobochik, right, that's extensional identity. It's the same thing, but Dokpatada, different intentions getting at it.
So is it
different modes of presentation?
Different modes of presentation. So if we said same substance, different way of thinking about it, is that wrong?
I wouldn't interpret
Yeah.
the word substance in there.
Oh,
But
because
but I'd
that's
say
a loaded term.
same entity, two different modes of
Same
presentation.
entity, two different.
Mobile entity, right?
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, mobile. Yeah. Interesting. So the two truths exist in that way for
That's how the two
Tsongkhapa
truths
and
exist.
and Chandrakirti.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah,
And that really is, I think, the Prasangika position.
yeah. Very interesting. Okay, so wow, this has been fascinating. And now maybe a complete left turn, right?
Yeah.
So you mentioned language.
I
So
did.
convention and language.
Yep.
And maybe this is an interesting question. I've been at a conference all day on AI and the publishing industry.
Oh, that sounds
Right? So
horrifying.
this is like I've been like hearing all these experts talk about AI. And then I was thinking, I wonder what Jay would like in his Buddhist philosophy mode would say about AI. And so now AI, how do you think about AI? And maybe I'll ask a more interesting question then, is AI conscious or something like that? The
Yeah,
question
please
I
don't
want
ask
to
that.
the question I want to ask is, if things exist through convention,
Mhm.
could AI establish conventions that are conventionally true?
Yeah. So what you're really asking is what I always call, when I'm talking with my students, the how question.
Yeah.
I think there is no particular reason to think that the ability to participate in norm-governed conventions is tied that deeply to our biological nature. I think our biological nature is important for the way that we do that.
Yeah.
And I do believe that. I think our embodiment's important. But just as let me talk about this. Let me give a bigger context.
Yeah.
I spent a fascinating week this past summer at Lama Tsongkhapa Institute at the European Scientific Research Institute conference with Mind and Life Europe, which was just terrific. And the theme of that conference was essentially sentience in the Anthropocene age, and how to understand sentience. And I was really happy about that because it made me think harder about sentience, which I really hadn't thought about too much. I mean, what is sentience? And just as I was talking about cognitive illusions earlier, I think here's an illusion about sentience that's one that we never notice. And I think that lots of people who are really good philosophers don't notice this, that even when we learn to really talk about cognition and talk about dependent origination from the outside, as it were, and really learn to think about that in terms of dependent origination rather than a primitively given experience, right?
Yeah.
When we start talking about sentience, we immediately retreat to the inner, and we say sentience is something about my inner life.
Yeah.
And that's that Augustinian intuition. And every time anybody says something Augustinian, I get really worried. And that's the idea of kind of inventing an inner chamber in which these things happen, right? That was Augustine's great genius, and it was wrong. Now, thinking that way, I thought, so how should we think about sentience?
Yes.
And I thought, well, sentience is kind of a homeostatic, autopoetic, to use Cisco Varella's lovely term, ongoing interaction with the environment around us. That's what we're doing when we're perceiving.
Yeah.
We've got this kind of autopoetic, homeostatic interaction with our environment that enables action, that enables us to engage in the kinds of behaviors appropriate to us. It's a detection, but it's more than just detection like a kind of motion detector. It's this complicated, embedded sort of detection. I thought, when you think about it that way, organisms aren't the only kinds of things that are sentient. Communities are sentient.
Communities.
Biosystems are sentient. The earth is sentient. And thinking about sentience and sentient beings in this way allows us to open up the sphere of moral concern well beyond us. And this took me back to Dogen too.
Yeah.
So when Dogen asks the question in response to, the question about what has Buddha nature, and says, grasses have Buddha nature, mountains have Buddha nature, the wind has Buddha nature.
Yes.
What's he talking about when he's talking about Buddha nature? He's talking about these things are sentient beings. Why are they sentient? Because just like us, they engage in this kind of homeostatic interaction with the world around them. So this is all coming back to your question.
Yeah, I got it.
If ecosystems can be sentient beings, why can't so suitably sophisticated artificially intelligent systems? I don't see a reason to exclude them. Suitably significant, suitably sophisticated, and able to enter norm-governed interactions with us. Yeah.
So sentience, what would be the qualification of sentience then, other than being able to engage with a complicated system?
Yeah, I just don't see that there's much more.
What about, like, for example, feeling, right?
Well, again, it depends what
Vedana.
you mean by feeling. If your analysis of feeling
Yeah.
is something from the interior,
Yeah.
then I want to say, think again about what feeling is.
But it could be connected to being embodied as well.
Our feeling is connected to being embodied.
Yeah.
But an ecosystem's feeling isn't connected to being embodied.
And then therefore I would exclude it from sentience.
Yeah, and I would say, well, maybe that's looking at sentience, restricting sentience to embodiment in a way that really requires a little interrogation.
Yeah, or else I could say that it's downgrading sentience as well, right? So what would be the argument to...
Or I'd say it's upgrading embodiment.
Upgrading embodiment, okay. And the reason for doing that is because it gets you to a better moral state.
I think so.
Yeah.
So if you think that where the rubber hits the road in metaphysics is at ethics.
Yeah.
And we think about why we care about sentience in the first place.
Yeah.
The reason we care. So when there are people who say, oh, gee, it doesn't matter how you treat cows, they're not really, like us. You want to say, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense, right? They have embodiment like us, and they have,
they feel.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, all right. So then we've said, okay, the reason for doing that, for really emphasizing the sentience of cows, is to expand our moral sphere to include cows.
Yes.
The reason that Dogen or I want to expand the range of sentience to ecosystems or to planets is to extend our moral concern. And if that's the reason, then we have to ask whether once, as I say, I call it the how problem, right?
Yeah.
Once you've got a machine that has clearly, whether accurately or illusorily, we do it illusorily, representing itself as a being engaged in norm-governed interactions with other beings, what's the basis for not treating it morally?
Yeah, it's a question we're going to have to deal with, right?
It is.
Because large language learning models right now, it feels like when you think about Buddhism and what constitutes cognition and they have this idea of the 5 always going mental factors. If you take that seriously, you would say that this AI is getting very good at one of them, which is this, samnya, ascertainment. Right? It's getting very good at ascertainment, but I can't see it even pretending to do feeling it. But once you embody the AI, embody the AI in a robot, and it starts being scared and stuff like that,
then you have to start really thinking.
Yeah.
And then you just have to think, why is an organic body special? Think about it this way. Suppose, I'm thinking about the great film Jules that's just, if you haven't seen it, see Jules, it's great. But you imagine an alien being from another planet coming down. There's no reason to believe that their body is going to be carbon-based. Maybe it's silicon-based. Yeah. And they're just like us, only silicon. Why say, we don't have to worry about them, they're not made of carbon? Yeah. That'd be really weird, right? Yeah. And we may be making them right now. Yeah. And I think we need to confront that question. I don't know exactly what the answer is. I just think that this is a question we can't simply write off. Yeah. And when people say things like, oh, large language models are really just parlor tricks because all they're doing is predicting what's going to happen next.
Yes, people say that.
People say that. And I want to say, well, that might be true, but I might be a parlor trick too. Yeah. Because I know that my cognition is largely predictive. Yeah. And I don't actually know how those things are making their predictions, but I don't know how I am either. And so it may well be that I'm just as much a parlor trick as ChatGPT. It's just not a very good one yet. Yes. And it isn't very good yet.
Well, you have the illusion of a self.
Right. And it
subjectivity, right?
Well, when I talk to ChatGPT, and I point out to it how badly it's, getting things wrong, which I really enjoy doing.
It apologizes.
It does. What it said to me the last time when it was just getting things wrong again and again and again. And because I was being really mean too.
Yes.
I was asking it questions about me, right?
Yeah.
And it was just getting everything. And I said, ChatGPT, I actually am Jay Garfield, and I know that you're wrong. And it said, oh, I'm sorry. I'm just a large language model, and I can't tell the difference between truth and falsity.
Yeah.
I apologize.
Yeah.
Now, that's a little scary
Yes. Yes,
at
yes.
every level, right?
Yes,
At every
exactly.
level.
Every bit of that sentence is scary.
Every bit of that is scary. Yes.
The thing is, we've parked subjectivity, right? So
We've
that's a
parked-
big question. And
Yep.
the thing about this is, as this develops, it's going to ask us questions about who we are.
Yeah.
Are we just a predicting machine as well? Or is there something special about subjectivity or something like that? So we're going to learn, it seems we're going to learn
Yeah.
a lot of work for philosophers to do. Actually.
Absolutely. It's a good thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that way we won't be, put out of business by evil
Exactly.
deans.
Yes.
But the other thing about that, though, is that it's going to force us to really confront the possibility that when we reflect on our own subjectivity, especially if we do it just introspectively,
Yeah.
we may get it badly wrong.
Mhm. Which is your intuition, it seems.
That's my intuition. The other place this comes from, by the way, for people who just want to really do some nice reading, is from what I still regard as the best essay in philosophy of mind written in America in the 20th century. And that is Wilfrid Sellers' Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, when he attacks what he calls beautifully the myth of the given, the idea that somehow we can just look inside and figure out what's going on, and really points out that we introspect in categories that derive from our public language use and derive from our thoughts about what explanation is. And that's not getting at reality.
Yeah.
That's just a model. That's just a model.
Yeah.
I think we have to be really humble about our introspective capacities.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well said. Thank you so much. We're going to have a break now for 5 minutes, and then you get to ask Jay your questions about
Cool.
whatever you like. He's got the answers. And what I wanted to say also, if you're enjoying this conversation and interested in Buddhism and philosophy, Wisdom Academy has 3 and also 4, if you include Guy's course with Jay. So you could spend a whole year of doing Buddhist philosophy with Jay through the Wisdom Academy. And also now, if you were to do each course one after another, that would be about $1,000. So we've got a special offer. If you join the Wisdom Experience membership, you can do it for less than half that. And so there'll be more info in the chat if you're interested in delving in and taking a year of doing Buddhist philosophy with Jay through the Wisdom Academy. So just wanted to share that. More info in the chat. We'll have a break now. Thank you so much, everyone. And we'll be back with your questions and Jay Garfield. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to share my concern about secular ethics. If we human beings, 7 million human beings, will become more compassionate, more sensible, I think billions of trillions of other sentient beings, I think comparatively, I think less disturbances.
This is mindfulness. This is mindfulness in the Buddhist context, and it's everywhere.
And it is more than, it's a step beyond.
They still don't understand selflessness.
To experience deep and fierce, sometimes, compassion.
But I can't practice introspection on you, because introspection is always reflexive.
Now only thing is, only the hope. education. It is our responsibility through our own experience.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you. And thank you for all your questions. So we'll get straight into it. Okay, first question. Can you really imagine the impossible? Or is it only possible to imagine that something impossible could exist?
That's a lovely question. It's a deep question. It's a question that contemporary philosophers fight about all the time. I tend to think that the human imagination is an extremely flexible, powerful, and deceptive tool. And that it's pretty easy for me to imagine things that I know are impossible. So for instance, well, here's a nice example. Our technical point, right? Kurt Gödel proved that arithmetic is either incomplete or inconsistent. Footnote, a lot of different ways to interpret that. Leave it aside for a minute. But his second incompleteness theorem is much more interesting. And that is, he showed that arithmetic is consistent if and only if you cannot prove that it's consistent. So that if you could prove the consistency of arithmetic, that would make arithmetic inconsistent. But nobody's ever been able to come up with a proof that it was consistent, and you can prove that you can't come up with such a proof. I had this friend who was absolutely sure that he'd done it, that he had proven the inconsistency of arithmetic by proving its consistency. And he was so sure that he had that proof. He wasn't just imagining it. It turns out the proof doesn't work. But he wasn't only able to imagine it, he was able to be sure that he had done it. So I know that you can imagine the impossible. And if you just allow yourself, the right kind of flights of fancy, look into an M.C. Escher painting and just imagine yourself in one of those, impossible sets of staircases or something going up and down, and put yourself into the painting. I think if you can't imagine the impossible, then probably you haven't relaxed enough with your imaginative capacities. Or perhaps you just need to spend some more time with psychedelics.
Very nice. Okay, so it seems the philosophers are in the house tonight. We have this question. Is the theory of self an expansion of or compatible with Parfit's bundle theory of self?
That's a really interesting question too. There is, of course, now a fairly substantial cottage industry on Parfit and Buddhist philosophy. And Mona Machada's recent book on Vasubandhu is one of the more recent forays in that. I'm advertising Monima's book. It's actually really interesting. Oren Hanner wrote a fabulous dissertation on Buddhism and Derek Parfit too at the University of Hamburg. I'm also advertising that as a great exploration of the Buddhist Parfit distinction. But that's not what you asked for. Parfit is not very regimented about his use of the word self. His analyses are very profound, I think, and very interesting. But he doesn't draw the careful distinction that I think he should between self and person. And I have the feeling that if we were to take Reasons and Persons, Parfit's book, and regiment the use more, then the argument would have been more clear, and that Parfit would have found himself arguing that there is no self, and that we are in fact persons. And I think that is the right way to read what Parfit is trying to do. And a little more regimentation would have helped that. Analogy here. Suppose you were worried about, spoiler alert, those of you who are who have small children should get them out of the Zoom right now. Suppose you thought there was a Santa Claus. And you figure, yeah, we know what Santa Claus is. He's the guy who has the flying reindeer who can come down chimneys. And then you kind of learn that there is no such person. And then you go to the mall before Christmas and you see this big fat guy in a red suit, and it says, you know, come sit on Santa's knee and all of that. You would not say, oh, Santa is not a guy with flying reindeer who comes on chimneys. He's a fat retired fireman at the mall. You wouldn't say that. You would say, there is no Santa Claus. There's just a guy pretending to be Santa Claus at the mall. And similarly, I think the right thing to say, not only about the self and the person, but about Parfit's own analysis, is not that the self is really just a constantly changing bundle. That's saying Santa really is the guy at the mall. But to say there is no self, there is no guy who comes down the chimney. Instead, there's a person that we confuse with a self. And when we talk about primal confusion in Buddhism as the fundamental, the most basic cause of samsara, of the world of suffering, the very basic primal confusion is the confusion of that which has a self with that which doesn't have a self. That is to take ourselves to have selves, even though we don't. And that's to say, my gosh, there is a Santa. It's just that he doesn't fly through the air. He just hangs out at the mall. And that would be really pretty serious. That's an error, right? You wouldn't tell your kids, yes, you're right, there's nobody who comes down the chimney, but Santa did bring you the presents. That fat guy at the mall, he came in and last night and you wouldn't tell them that. And there's a reason for that.
Cool. All right. So this one's a longer question.
Oh, good.
I'll start with this. So what precisely does it mean to talk of an illusion on the subject side versus an illusion on the object side? And I'll give you the context now to the question. The division between illusion on the subject side and on the object side seems already to manifest the subject duality. Various perceptual illusions are also constituted by the way the mind works.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the Kanizsa square illusion is based on the innate tendency of the mind to complete the figure.
Yep.
So what does it mean to talk of an illusion on the subject side versus that of the illusion side, the object side?
Yeah, point well taken. And so the right way to put all of this, had we had enough time and enough precision to spell it out carefully, is that we begin, and as I say, I think we have an atavistic, unavoidable tendency to do this, to kind of split our experience into subjective and objective sides. And this isn't just me saying this, right? If we read, again, Yogacara texts, and we talk about what's going on in the Alaya Vijnana and the maturation of the potential for experience, we say that every potential, every seed in the Alaya Vijnana manifests with a subjective side and an objective side. Now, that doesn't mean there's really a subjective and an objective side. That means they appear to us to have a subjective and an objective side. Once we've got that appearance going, we can talk about illusions that pertain to the objects and illusions that pertain to what we take to be the subjects. But we're always talking about illusions about what we take to be the objects and illusions about what we take to be the subjects. In the end, these are all illusions about an experience that's primordially non-dual. So I agree with that completely. But that's a realization we can only come to at a certain stage in the dialectic. You can't begin by saying, okay, let's talk about non-dual experience and the illusions of non-dual experience. Because most people are going to say, wait a minute, experience is just primordially dualistic. There's me, the subject, and there's my objects. So, but then what we can do is we can take that appearance, not the reality, but the appearance of subject-object duality and talk about illusions regarding the nature of what we take to be objective versus illusions regarding the nature of which we take to be subjective. That has to be provisional, because in the end, our goal is to dissolve that apparent duality into a primordially non-dual understanding of our experience, which is hard to even talk about, by the way. Thank you for that. That's a really good question and a sharp insight.
Thank you, Carsten. So next question. So I guess the context here is the bee flying through the room.
Oh, yeah.
And the question is, how is it that, say, a bee or a dog and I can interact if our worlds are different?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. First of all, notice, for those of you who care about Buddhist cosmology and Buddhist moral psychology, this is an issue that comes up because when we talk about the 6 realms of cyclic existence, and if you really think about these beings as being cosmologically in different realms, you have to ask how they interact. So when you see, for instance, all the stories about human beings interacting with pretas, you have to wonder, how do they interact if they're in different realms, right? Or human beings and animals, where they are regarded as being in different realms. Now, the long story is, I think we shouldn't think of those things cosmologically at all. We should be thinking of those psychologically, but that's a different story. But the point is that everybody recognizes, whether in a Buddhist tradition or in the tradition of thinking about, say, behavioral neuroscience and how different kinds of animals' nervous systems end up engendering different kinds of representations of reality. We can say that even though there are differences, there's overlap. So if I'm outside with my dog and I'm throwing frisbees and he's catching them, a very common occurrence, by the way, it had better be the case that he and I are both seeing that frisbee as something flying through the air that I can throw and he can catch, and he knows to bring it back to me. He's aware of who I am and I'm aware of who he is, and so forth. That's right, and that's because our worlds overlap to a great extent. But overlap doesn't mean identity. And the world he inhabits is, I know, largely opaque to me. And he doesn't know, but it's true that the world that I inhabit is largely opaque to him. But there's enough overlap between those worlds that there's room for interaction. All we need is overlap. Notice that that's true even in intraspecies interaction. So if I'm talking with my students who are a lot younger than I am, I won't tell you how much younger, and in my case, most of whom are women, they live in a very different world from mine, and I'm kind of aware of that. And they roll their eyes when they see the world that I live in, which they think of as really weird. Fortunately, we have enough overlap that we can have great classes and great discussions and things like that. But I don't want to pretend that I see the world the way an 18-year-old undergraduate student sees the world, and they can't pretend to see the world the way that I see the world. Nonetheless, there's enough overlap that we can talk, and that helps. Overlap's all you need. You don't need identity.
So next question is there a technical Buddhist term for what you call primal confusion?
Yeah, there is. Often that term is translated as ignorance or confusion. So we could be thinking here about avidya, for instance, if we're in the Sanskrit, or timu, Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
There is. This is something that runs right through Buddhism. So when we talk about, this is all second noble truth stuff, by the way. So the first noble truth, as you know, is that the world is permeated by suffering, and suffering of various kinds. The second noble truth is that, bumper stickers to the contrary notwithstanding, suffering doesn't just happen, it's caused. And the cause is triune, and that's represented in the hub of the wheel of the Bhava Chakra, the wheel of existence. And the proximal causes of that suffering are attraction and aversion. But they, in turn, are caused by this fundamental primal confusion, this atavistic sense that I and other things exist intrinsically when in fact we're empty. This atavistic sense that there's a real subject-object duality, when in fact the world is primordially non-dual and so forth. It's that confusion that we're talking about. So this is all explored in Buddhist philosophy in great depth in discussions of the second noble truth.
Wonderful. Can you define the two truths again as per Tsongkhapa? Is the wish from the audience.
So you want a semester's worth of talks right now. Tsongkhapa's discussion is extensive, deep, profound, and I can't possibly do justice to all of it here. But fortunately, Wisdom Publications and Snow Lion have made that possible for you. Wisdom Publications through Thupten Jinpa's brilliant translation of illuminating the intent, which is Tsongkhapa's commentary on Chandrakirti's Introduction to the Middle Way. And if you read the 6th chapter there, you'll get really good. I'm not going to dodge the question. I will answer it. I'm just telling you where you can get better answers. So, and the other would be in the beautiful translation of Lamrim Chenmo, the great exposition of the stages of the path to awakening. If you turn to volume 3 and read the special insight section, the section on the two truths, you'll get really cool stuff. All right, so that's the fobbing you off on actually reading Tsongkhapa. But the real issue, the kernel of the idea that I was talking with Daniel about earlier is this, that while you might be tempted to think that the two truths are entirely distinct, and that the ultimate truth is truth as it is, right, is just the essence of reality, and that conventional truth is actually just falsehood, or what you do, a veil of illusion that you strip away, and then you finally get to see ultimate truth. Tsongkhapa thinks that would be a terrible mistake. And in thinking that that would be a terrible mistake, he's actually following Chandrakirti's exposition of the two truths in Introduction to the Middle Way, and Chandrakirti is following Nagarjuna's exposition of the two truths in Mula Madhyamaka Karikai, in the fundamental verses on the Middle Way, and in particular, the way that the two truths are explained in the 24th chapter of that text, which is actually called the Investigation of the Four Noble Truths, but it's really about the two truths. And there, Nagarjuna does two beautiful things in rapid succession. First, he tells us that if you don't understand the distinction between the two truths, the difference between the two truths, you're completely hopeless. That you have to understand the distinction between the two truths in order to understand the Dharma. You have to understand the Dharma in order to gain liberation. So he emphasizes these are totally different. A few verses later, he says, oh, and by the way, they're identical. Because he tells you whatever is dependent origination, whatever is part of conventional truth, is emptiness, is the ultimate truth. And that identity is just a dependent designation. So it's just empty as well. And that's the middle way. Now, so Nagarjuna has told us there that the two truths are completely distinct and two truths are identical. And it's not like he's told us in two different books or even two different chapters. He's told us this within a 6-verse span. And so it's really important, if we want to understand the relationship between the two truths, to reconcile those two claims and to understand how they can both be correct. And so the way that we do this in the tradition of Chandrakirti, as expounded by Tsongkhapa, is as follows. To say that we can distinguish between the sense in which the two truths are identical and the sense in which the two truths are different. And by the way, we need a kind of terminological pause here for a minute, because we've been talking in terms of truths. The word is satya or tempa, but that word is sometimes translated as realities, or so if we think about two realities or two realms even. And I think it's important to see that's not an ambiguity. That's this long tradition in contemporary Buddhist philosophy of saying, oh, gee, the word satya is ambiguous between truth and reality. Forget that completely. It means one thing, but it's something that takes us back to a much older meaning of the word truth. Truth in English, and this is really weird, but I'm going to try to explain what satya means in Sanskrit by talking about what the etymology of the word truth in English. It's going to explain why talking about truth and reality amount to the same thing. Because the cool thing about the word truth is that the word truth and the word trust are the same word in English. And they both come from the wonderful Middle English word troth, as in the old-fashioned wedding ceremony, I plight thee my troth. I put my trust in you. Or I will be true to you. And it means both of those things simultaneously. So and it's not until about the 17th century that the primary use of the word true in English referred to sentences or referred to beliefs. Before that, it would have been like a true coin as opposed to a counterfeit coin, or a true friend, something in which you can trust. So when we talk about true sentences or true beliefs, We mean sentences we can trust in our reasoning, beliefs we can trust to guide our action. And it's really important to remember that, because if we think about that in English, we see that to treat something as sat, is to think of it as something we can trust. A table is a conventional truth because you can trust the table when you put a book on it to hold it. Persons are conventional truths because we can rely on them and trust them, and so forth. So really, there's not a big ontological thing here. We're talking about, is this something you can trust completely or something you can only trust within the realm of convention? So with all of that in the background, I told you asked a hard question. You asked for it though. With all of that in the background, Tsongkhapa and Chandrakirti's point about how to understand Nagarjuna is this. When we ask ourselves at the level of entities, of ontology, what the relationship is between the conventional truth and the ultimate truth, they're the same thing. To be empty is to be dependently originated. To be dependently originated is to be conventionally real. To be empty is to be just conventionally real. That's what it is. It's to be empty of being anything more than conventionally real. That's the sense of identity. That's an extensional identity. Whatever is an emptiness is also a conventionally real thing. But the same thing might have two different modes of presentation, two different modes by which we know it. So for instance, to take the example that I used earlier, Joe Biden is both the leader of the Democratic Party and commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the United States. We don't say that because he has those two natures, that he's two different people. Rather, we say you can look at him from the standpoint of the military, and he's commander-in-chief, or you can look at him from the standpoint of the Democratic Party and say he's the guy in charge. Notice that those two things do not always coincide. There was a time when somebody else was commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and that person was not the leader of the Democratic Party. You'll remember that. I don't want to say any more than that because there are names I don't like to say in public. And so that shows us that those two modes of presentation can come apart, but they can also coincide. So the point about the identity of the two truths is that there's no ontological difference, no difference in being between conventional truth and ultimate truth, but they appear differently. Ultimate truth is the appearance of things as empty. Conventional truth is their appearance as dependently originated phenomena. That's the sense in which, as Tsongkhapa puts it, they are mobochik, that is extensionally identical, but dokpa tadat, that is different in intention, different, conceptually different. Just like it's a different concept to think of Joe Biden as the commander-in-chief versus the head of the Democratic Party, but it's the same dude about whom we're thinking. Help?
Very cool. I like conventionally trustworthy. Samvriti Satya.
Yeah, it's really nice. It's not a good idea in general to try to explain Sanskrit by English etymology.
Yeah,
this is not something I recommend. It's just that it works so beautifully in this particular case. And we do best when we think about truth in terms of trust.
Yeah,
it really works. You can stop thinking about correspondence theories of truth and coherent theories of truth. And you can stop thinking of truth as a relation, which is what I really like. I think that one of the great myths in thinking about truth is thinking that truth is a relation between things rather than a kind of one place property being trustworthy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. Okay, we're coming to the end of our time, but maybe we finish with this one question, since you've started giving us a nice reading list.
Okay.
So what book that you've written gives the best and clearest explanation of Chandrakirti's view of the conventional as you explained in your talk?
Book that I've written that does that. I'm going to give you two places to go, but say stay tuned for coming attractions. So my book, Engaging Buddhism, when it talks about the two truths, is shamelessly channeling Tsongkhapa and Chandrakirti. So the two truths chapter in my book, Engaging Buddhism, is one place. The other place, though, that I think is much more fun is not just my book, but a book that 10 of us co-authored, and we called ourselves the Yak Herds. There's another place too. Let me go back. There's a book that another 10 of us co-authored called The Cowherds. There's a theme here. And the Cowherds book called Moon Shadows, Conventional Truth in Buddhist Philosophy, really works a lot hard on how to understand Chandrakirti, and in some chapters Tsongkhapa, on the two truths. So there's a number of chapters in Moon Shadows, and that's published by Oxford University Press. I'm sorry not to be offering them. But then the other book is the book by the Yak Herds, a kind of successor group called Knowing Illusion. And there what we're looking at is the history of the Tibetan debates about how to understand Chandrakirti's Prasangika Madhyamaka. So we're looking at the debate that got started when the great Sakya scholar, Daksan Lotsawa, criticized Tsongkhapa's interpretation, and all of the back and forth between Tsongkhapa's followers and people who picked up Daksan's banner, mostly in the Kagyu tradition, debating about how to understand Chandrakirti. That's a 2-volume set. The first volume is just our history of that debate. And the second volume translates all of the major texts in that debate. So you can kind of open them up both on your desk and see if we're being honest as you read that. So that's a deeper dive, by the way, than reading Engaging Buddhism, and also a much deeper dive than reading Moon Shadows. I think Moon Shadows might be the best place to start. And then maybe you could work your way up to Knowing Illusion. Yeah, that's what I would say.
And they could take your Wisdom Academy course.
They could.
The second course would be perfect.
Exactly. The second part of the 3-part Wisdom Academy course would be fun.
And if your mind can handle this, but a whole year of it, you can do all the courses and special offer in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So that would be really hard. I can't imagine watching myself for all that time.
No, it's brilliant. It's fantastic and brilliant. A year of Buddhist philosophy. Fantastic. So if you want to delve deep, that's the way to do it. Of course, there's a heap of readings in those, and then all those books that Jay's talked about. Jay, thank you so much for joining us. I wanted
Thank you so much for having me.
Leave us with some final wisdom, if you would do that.
I don't have much wisdom, but here's one thing that I would say. It can be really useful to take small bits of expressions of insight from philosophers, Western or Asian, and spend time thinking about those. I've found that a lot of what's driven me philosophically is not a book or an article, but a sentence. A line like "painted rice cakes doesn't satisfy hunger," or a line like "this triple world is not as it appears, nor is it different." I find that when I just think about those lines, things happen. And I think that meditation on those is a really useful way to do philosophy. The other thing I would say is, remember what my teacher says. Every syllable of Buddha Dharma is in the end about ethics.
And with that, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Next Dharma Chat, we're going to talk about poetry.
Ooh.
And Dharma as poetry. So we'll have John Brem joining us. We'll have a bit of a live audience, and I think that's in a couple of weeks coming up. But thank you for sharing this night with us and doing some Buddhist philosophy. It's been fun. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you.
And good night, everyone.
I want to share my concern about secular ethics. If we human beings, 7 million human beings, are becoming more compassionate, more sensible, I think billions of trillions of other sentient beings, I think comparatively, I think less disturbances.
So this is mindfulness. This is mindfulness in the Buddhist context, and it's everywhere.
And it is more than, it's a step beyond.
They still don't understand selflessness.
To experience deep and fierce sometimes compassion.
But I can't practice introspection on you, because introspection is always reflexive.
Now only thing is, only sort of the hope, education. It is our responsibility through our own experience